Good afternoon, Assembly member.
Hey, what's going on? How are you guys?
We're good, we're good. By the way, I'm Mario. We're going to go ahead and get started now. We were just waiting for a few folks to hop on. It's 11:05. And so, yeah, let's get started. So, Rachel, we're good? Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our California Legislative Update on Affordable Housing webinar. My name is Mario Lopez, and I am the Civic Engagement Manager with Silicon Valley at Home. As many of you know, Silicon Valley at Home is the voice of affordable housing here in Silicon Valley, representing a broad range of interests from leading employers who are driving the Bay Area economy to labor and service organizations, to nonprofit and for-profit developers who provide housing and services to those most in need. This webinar is in partnership with California YIMBY and Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California as part of our Affordable Housing Month series of virtual events. Affordable Housing Month is our organization's public awareness campaign to elevate the need for more affordable housing throughout Silicon Valley and the Bay Area region as a whole. We have an exciting program for you all today, and we are joined by Assemblymember Robert Rivas, who represents the southern portion of Santa Clara County and northern portions of, I think, Monterey County, if I'm not mistaken. We'll dive into that as well. Who will share a little bit of what's going on at the state capitol, as well as a key piece of legislation that he has put forward in the form of Assembly Bill 3155. We will then provide an overview of the three-piece framework of production, preservation, and protection to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And then we're going to dive into the governor's May budget revise, as well as affordable housing legislation that will be discussed by our partners at California YIMBY. Luis Morante, the legislative director, has joined us. Pedro Calval, the policy director for NPH, will be speaking. And then Cresselia Castillo-Crings, who is with our lobbyist for As We at Home with Sacramento Advocates, will also facilitate the conversations with us this morning. So with that said, if you have any questions, please use the questions and answers box at the bottom of the screen. We'll go ahead and field those questions as they come in throughout the program. And then just as an FYI, we are going to be recording this. And so we'll send out a follow-up email to everybody with the webinar recording and a survey for you to complete that will help inform the way that we implement these webinars in future events. So with that, I'll hand it over to California Assemblymember Robert Rivas. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, hey Mario, really excited for the opportunity. I do want to thank Cresselia with Sacramento Advocates. I do want to thank her for the invitation to join you guys this morning. And then, I'm honored to be, one of the speakers and to open this thing up. Lewis with California YIMBY is a great friend, a tremendous advocate for all housing. And so I know you had mentioned, Mario, that this is Affordable Housing Month, which I was unaware of, but we should have affordable housing year, or every day should be Affordable Housing Day, because that's the depth of the crisis that this state is in and that a lot of parts of California are in. So certainly I'm, had a call yesterday with CNN, and I talked to them. They had reached out because they wanted to talk about some farm worker issues, and issues, as we face this pandemic, and how that's impacting, our farm workers in this state. And so every part of that conversation went back to how farm workers live and the housing conditions that they face. And the reason why I mention that is because, I talked about my experience, and I have for the last year, the short time I've been in the legislature. This is still my first term, but certainly talking about, I'm not an expert in housing, but certainly it's become my number one priority in the legislature, because I can talk about the importance of housing security from a personal perspective, because I was raised by immigrant farm workers. I grew up in poverty. I lived in a small 2-bedroom farm worker housing unit with 9 other members of my family. There were 10 of us, and I was raised by my grandparents. And so when I look back on my experience and the opportunities I've had in my life, and the fact that I get to this incredible opportunity to be an advocate for housing and to represent a region that I grew up in poverty in the state legislature, I attribute all of that to the housing stability that I had as a child, and the housing stability that my family had, no matter how inadequate it was. And that's the reason why this is so important. It should be important for all of us. Is so many children from farm working families, middle class families, they aren't going to experience on the track we are on. They aren't going to experience the same opportunities that we all have, and that's a big problem. And so certainly this housing problem, this housing problem we have is a problem facing the United States of America, but the problem is much worse in California. And when you look at what stems our housing problems, it isn't the result of greed or unhonest people. Some are the current slate of bills, a bill that I've introduced that I'll talk about here momentarily. There was a tweet by a labor organization, and they stated that us legislators, myself included, all of us that introduce housing bills, that they implied because they opposed, I think they opposed a whole lot of our housing bills currently in the legislature. But what they suggested was that some of us are staying home and plotting our Oklahoma land grab, our legislative strategy. And that accusation was leveraged despite the fact that the bill we introduced, all the bills that you see currently related to housing and housing production and solving this housing crisis, they were introduced prior to this pandemic in February. And so this type of rhetoric, these false accounting of our legislative process in California is a complete a distortion of our legislative intent. I know it's a distortion of my legislative intent. And it's stuff like this is why we have the housing crisis we are in, and why we have the problems that we do, because there's a big difference, a world of difference between the economic demand and the factors that that drive housing and the social need for housing. And so certainly the connections between our housing crisis currently and this growing personal crisis for millions and millions of Californians is becoming more and more evident each and every day. I see it as a new legislator. I see it in the district I represent, and the extent and the nature of our housing crisis. It varies dramatically here in California. It varies between different groups from different regions. And to be quite honest, California's housing problems, they affect homeowner occupiers. And the insane mortgages that we all have to pay. Prior to my time in the legislature, I had to maintain 3 jobs. I was a county supervisor, worked in education. I was an adjunct professor. I had to maintain 3 jobs to support my family, to pay my mortgage. You have in the state our tenants that are struggling to keep up with rent. This is a housing crisis that is impacting middle-class families, as well as our working class families, our lowest wage earners, and as I mentioned, like farm workers. And the family and the environment that I grew up in. And so certainly at this point, some counties and some cities or some regions, they shouldn't be offering here in our state more housing security or better opportunities than any other part of the state. And that's why, we are all in this together, all parts of this state, whether it's labor organizations, whether it's, real estate lobby, we are all in this together. And it's going to take all of us to solve this problem, because the truth is, here in California, our housing problems result from this structural logic, the creation or this evolution of our current housing system, and it's a system we have to fix. And if we're going to make real progress on our housing problems, it requires us that we work together and develop pragmatic, forward-thinking, and most importantly, bold alternatives to what we currently have. And so, you know, certainly I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'd be happy to dive into my bill, you know, but, you know, I think our bill, which is Assembly Bill 3155, it's a Moderate Income Housing Act. And what it does is, sorry, I'm getting all these messages and I can't see the screen. You know, what it does is it tries to tackle this larger issue of affordability. You know, here in California, you know, how do we achieve affordability? There's a lot. You know, I work with incredible colleagues that are incredibly articulate. They know a lot more than I do when it comes to housing, when it comes to the policy process. If we had a solution to affordable housing and how to develop it, you know, we would have, you know, we wouldn't be talking this morning. But the problem is, you know, how we achieve affordability in this state is, one, there's a huge reliance on public subsidies. But obviously, as a state, as we now face the largest budget deficit gap in the history of our state, you know, how do we achieve affordability? And I believe, as our bill attempts to accomplish, is trying to diversify our housing stock. And so, you know, by pursuing policies that can result in housing innovation, that's why you know, really reforming, you know, zoning laws, outdated zoning laws in this state, trying to do everything we can to allow our communities to develop in ways that conform to the character of those communities, but allow us to do something different. You know, let's get away from these single family home style developments, and let's get, you know, let's let local governments have the ability to be innovative in creating, you know, small lot homes, as our bill is proposing. And you know, and so if we're able to provide a housing stock that meets the needs of the diverse population in this state, based on income, based on family circumstances, you know, we certainly need to do that. We need to do better, because we're at a point now where home ownership is at an all-time low. The prospects of becoming homeowners is you know, a distant reality for many families. We could talk about home ownership, we could talk about rent, but the reality is subletting, critically overcrowded conditions for families is a reality. Subletting a bedroom, subletting a couch, subletting a garage. In my district, you have people subletting sheds. It is, you know, it is truly a sad situation. And it's something that requires us to solve problems. And as I mentioned, when I presented our bill in the committee, I received a number of calls to kill my bill, to not hear the bill, but nothing was brought to me as an alternative. And I refused to do nothing. We all have to refuse to do nothing. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep, you know, doing everything we can. And I can't emphasize enough to work together to solve this problem, because that's what it is going to take. And that's why I appreciate organizations like SV Home and other groups throughout the state. You know, we certainly need all the resources and all the advocates we can to ensure that we're providing housing for all people, all families in this state.
Assembly members, thank you so much for joining us. We are just excited to have you, and not just today, but also have you in the state legislature representing a lot of, just bringing in your ideas and making sure you're fighting for the rest of us. I really appreciate you being here. We're excited to have you as a housing champion in Sacramento. One of the things that I think would be really helpful for us to understand, especially because you are carrying contentious bills, I think your perspective on housing is unique. You bring a lot of experiences from your own personal experience, also your district. And just one of the questions that we have and would love to hear from you is, could you describe the key political dynamics impacting the legislature's ability to pass significant housing policy this year, especially in light of just the different conversations that are having? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, and, you know, as a new member of the legislature, you know, I have very little body of work to rely on and to speak from experience, I guess you can say. But, you know, certainly, you know, the best experience to help prepare me for this position in the legislature was the experience I brought from local government. I was a county supervisor for 8 years in the county of San Benito. And it was those 8 years that I was elected when I was 30 years old. It was in 2010. I was sworn in 2011. But it was those 8 years where I learned how to make decisions. I learned how to work with other people. And so that was the best, other than what my kindergarten teacher told me, and be nice to others, and play fair, just, always do your best to be kind and work with others. And so, it's those things that I've carried with me to this position. And I view the policy process as being a very comprehensive process, a collaborative process. And so every bill that I've had since last year, my first year, was to try to foster this collaborative approach. And we obviously introduce a bill to solve a problem. Obviously, there's stakeholders on both sides of any issue and any policy in any policy area or space. But it's trying to bring people together. And I think this year with our particular housing bills, as I mentioned in the beginning, we received some, not only my bill, but all bills, we received some heavy opposition from building trades and from certain labor organizations, and completely understand their concerns. But their opposition came in extraordinarily late. We had introduced this, these bills in February. And so certainly, I had personally reached out, when we learned of this opposition, and there was very little effort to, try to discuss, our particular bill, and to discuss and to learn about their concerns. And so certainly, the legislative process is a long one, and it's a long process. And so I'm obviously very, very motivated and committed to working with all stakeholders and to address concerns. But at the end of the day, it's working together, collaborating together to solve this problem, because doing nothing is going to do nothing to provide the housing for people that absolutely need it. We need all types of housing. We need low income, affordable housing for low wage earners. We need housing for moderate wage earners. Certainly, and what our bill is attempting to do is to provide, it's modeled after the city of LA and their small lot subdivision ordinance that they have, and they've had in existence since 2005. It's trying to create a tool utilizing Senator Scott Wiener's SB 35, a very innovative approach to streamline infill development for small lot homes of 10 units or less. And this is something that we were willing to take on, because when you look at the precedent that's been set in California, where in existing law under SB 35, there's an exemption for labor exemptions, and like a professional kind of staffing exemption for rental units of 10 units or less. And so we wanted to create parity in state law to also allow the same thing for 10 units or less, but providing not only for rental opportunities, but for home ownership opportunities. Is we should not only strive to provide rental opportunities for people, but we should provide those opportunities for first-time home buyers, for middle income, low wage earners to actually own a home, whether it's a townhome, a row house, building that equity and building that wealth is incredibly important for a lot of families, and we're losing sight of providing opportunity to people to become homeowners and to generate this type of wealth. But really, when you talk about affordability, and as I mentioned, our main mechanism to achieve affordability is through these subsidies, is providing opportunities for these small lot and small footprint homes. It creates natural opportunities to achieve affordability without a subsidy, because especially utilizing SB 35 in a streamlining process, it really reduces costs. And these across the state, whether you're looking at the resale of homes, these are homes, townhomes, row houses that are currently on the market. They are the most affordable now as resale homes. And so certainly trying to diversify our housing stock by utilizing this type of tool and potential development, certainly will go a long way to help meet our housing goals, but most importantly, address a significant humanitarian crisis in this state and provide housing opportunities for people. But I know that was a long-winded answer, but like any other policy, you know, in my opinion, people dig in their heels. They, you know, have interests that they're representing, but, you know, certainly it's, you know, trying to be as collaborative as we possibly can to really, I'm a data-driven person, and I think all the data is there. You have families that are suffering. We have a historic rate of homelessness, first in the nation rate of homelessness, first in the nation rate of poverty. Certainly it's time for us to put aside our political differences and come together and to solve this problem.
Again, really thank you and appreciate all the work that you are doing. You are right. You're looking at this in a very holistic way. This is not just about, you know, homeowners or renters, or it really has a severe impact on the entire health of California, for its economy, and just the ability to really move forward, recover in this economic downturn, and really achieve a lot of the goals that we as a society would want to achieve. So just wanted to say thank you on behalf of California YIMBY, Silicon Valley at Home, and NPH for giving us some time and kind of explaining to our audience what's going on in Sacramento, and for all the work you're doing. Really appreciate it. And I know that we're going to continue to work with you and help make sure that AB 3155 ends up becoming law. So thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and always feel free to reach out to myself or to our staff any way that we can be supportive, or if you have ideas for us, we are always, always willing to engage. So, but thanks so much, Cresselia.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, sir.
You too.
Great, thank you so much, Cresselia. So next, we're going to go ahead and pivot over to discussion of the Governor Newsom's May budget revise, and we're going to hand it over to Luis Morante, who is the Legislative Director for California YIMBY. Luis?
Hey, thank you, Mario. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today, and to SV at Home. Thank you, SV at Home, for hosting us. I just love listening to Assemblymember Rivas talk. He's just such an inspiration to me as an advocate. I just get so fired up every time I listen to him. And then, you know, I obviously was blushing extremely hard when he was talking about me. So I'm glad that I have had time to recover a little bit before being on camera myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Luis Morante. I'm the Legislative Director for California YIMBY. Here to talk to you a little bit about what we're seeing in the budget this year for housing. Some of my colleagues on the line, Graciela and Pedro, will probably have some feedback too that we can cover in Q&A. But I wanted to just give you all the highlights as the budget relates to housing, really talk about the things you need to know. I think one thing about this budget that is probably most noteworthy, and I'm absolutely plagiarizing my colleague Cresselia here, is that this governor has made it clear he sees housing as a priority, that he wants to move it forward, that he wants to be working on housing, he wants to be funding housing, which is a great change and relief from our previous governor, who sort of was a little bit more resentful of spending money on housing and on working on housing policy. Not to say he didn't get a bunch of great proposals signed into law, but it just wasn't as big of a priority for him as it clearly is for this governor. So for folks obviously know that COVID-19 has affected the budget in a huge way. The state of California is projecting about a $54 billion budget shortfall. But the governor has issued an update to his budget proposal called the May Revise. He issued it on the 14th of this month. And it has a lot of really encouraging things to say actually about housing that I'd like to run through just really quickly because we're kind of tight on time. So there are three main things in the budget from a funding perspective. The governor proposes to spend $331 million from the national mortgage settlement that then Attorney General Kamala Harris secured for California as a result of fraudulent loans being made to people during the mortgage foreclosure crisis. He proposes to spend that on housing counseling, mortgage assistance, and renter legal aid. All the more important now that a lot of advocates are kind of sounding the alarms about a potential wave of evictions that could come. I'm seeing stuff about people putting rent on their credit cards now. Like credit card processors are saying that rent is a huge, growing portion of their business, and that's just horrifying. The governor kept in a proposal from his January release when the governor was projecting a budget surplus. He kept in a proposal of $500 million to fund the state's low-income housing tax credit program, which helps construct low-income housing around the state and is really important. So that $500 million piece staying in was a big surprise, I think, to a lot of advocates. A lot of advocates forecast that that program was going to be cut from sort of below where it is now, but to see it sort of its funding be increased is very encouraging. And then the governor announced that California has either received or is the pass through of about $532 million from the Federal CARES Act to fund homelessness and housing. The budget does have some cutbacks to some programs that would have been funded, about $600 million loss to some infill grants and some mixed income grants, but really that piece on funding low income housing is probably the most important one there. And so it's really good to see that stay in. The governor has also proposed some changes to how the state does affordable housing applications to make it easier to submit those applications and get them approved. So streamlining a little bit of the housing on that angle, which is great. And the governor's signaled that he really wants to do something policy related through his budget as well. So the governor specifically says that he wants to leverage federal and state funds to accomplish upzoning, to accomplish streamlining, to accomplish some other affordable housing policies that I think many on this call will be familiar with and supportive of. So that's really encouraging. I don't have more detail about what the governor's considering for streamlining or for upzoning or producing more housing, but his budget document signals his intent to submit those ideas to the legislature at some point soon. And so, fingers crossed that what we eventually see is something that's quite positive. I can say that California YIMBY submitted comments to the governor's office about what we'd like to see out of streamlining and upzoning. And so, hopefully he's working with something like that from many different advocates. But, fingers crossed again that we see something positive there. So I think that's the highlights from the budget. I kind of want to just keep it short to help my colleagues on the other sort of future sections here, but I think we have about 5 minutes now for Q&A. And so now would be a great time to use either the chat feature or the question and answer feature, and someone can get back to you, and either I or one of my colleagues can answer your question about the budget. So I'm going to just take a breath there for a second and invite Morrow back.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. Appreciate you being able to provide us with a brief background of the May budget revise. So we're going to go ahead and see if there's any folks who have any questions. If not, then that's completely fine. We can move on over to our next segment and then circle back to opening it up to the audience at the end of the session. And so I think there are no questions relating right now to the budget.
So Mario, just one of the things that I wanted to add, and I know that especially in Sacramento, we tend to talk a lot about budget and legislative cycles, but just to kind of give the audience a little bit of a sense, when Luis is talking about the budget, there's actually this year, because of COVID and how things are impacted because of there's two major issues, right? When taxes are actually supposed to be remitted to the state, which is July 15th. Normally that happens in April, which ends up informing the projections that the governor actually lays out in his May revise. We don't have those numbers yet. So right now, that is going to impact future conversations. And the other issue is whether the state will be receiving federal funding. In the previous recession, the Fed stepped in and actually provided California billions of dollars. Depending on those two funding sources, things might look very different in October, in August of this upcoming year. And so one of the things that we foresee is the legislature has a constitutional obligation to pass the budget by June 15th of this year. However, some of the information that we would normally have for the state to make those decisions, they don't have right now. So what we project that will happen, and this is where I think Luis and I are keeping an eye on the budget and trailer bills, which is where the policy is made, in the next couple of weeks, we were probably going to see some of that policy being developed. And when the legislature kind of comes back after their summer break in August, we will continue to have those discussions. So I just wanted to kind of make sure that from a timeline perspective, over the next couple of months, things are going to be very interesting, and there's going to be a lot of, as people like to say, sausage making in Sacramento.
Great, thank you, Cresselia. Luis, do you have anything else to add before we shift over to the next section?
I think I'm good to go.
Okay, great. So next slide, please. So we're going to go ahead and offer both Cresselia and Pedro time to provide a brief overview of the 3Ps framework, which many of you may be familiar with. And so this might be just an overview. But for those who don't know, the 3Ps stand for the production, preservation, and protection as it relates to affordable housing legislation and policy that we're trying to enact. Cresselia, do you want to facilitate the section now?
Graciela, you're muted.
Thank you, Pedro. I wanted to make sure everybody was paying attention. So, Pedro, I think I'm going to actually punt it over to you. I understand that you actually have been with the Casa and now what has become the 3P since the beginning. So I'm going to kind of give it over to you, given your history with the entire transition.
All right. So first off, thank you so much, Mario and the SV at Home team for having me here. I'm Pedro Galvão, I'm the policy director at the Nonprofit Housing Association, Northern California. We do affordable housing advocacy at the regional and state levels and work with our local partners like SV at Home to advance local policy as well. We work in all 9 Bay Area counties and are happy to be a resource to you all on your questions around, these issues. And so going to the 3Ps, it arose out of a process called Casa, which was something that started off in late 2017 and lasted for a year and a half, where the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is our regional transportation planning agency, got together a group of 50 organizations across sectors, put them all in a room, and essentially said, come up with solutions to the Bay Area's housing crisis. And clearly we fixed it all, right? But what came out of that group, out of that process, was a document called the Casa Compact that had several elements of high-level agreement around the production of homes, both affordable and market rate, preservation of existing affordability, and protection of tenants from displacement. And that document really helped inform some of the state policy that was advocated and passed, especially last year. And so NPH in that role, both we participated in Casa, and Silicon Valley at Home was actually one of the process's co-chairs. So Leslie Cresselia, the executive director of Silicon Valley at Home, was one of the co-chairs. And after Casa concluded, it led to this coalition work called the 3Ps, which is a coalition of multi-sector organizations, many of which participated in Casa, and it's still co-chaired by Silicon Valley at Home, the San Francisco Foundation, and TMG Partners to bring together a multi-sectoral group of organizations that collectively are advancing bills that advance each one of these critical priorities for housing. And Cresselia, in her role in Sacramento Advocates, helps us advance this quite hefty package of bills, and helped us both last year in getting many of the bills across. A couple of examples are a bill to finally enforce the Surplus Land Act, or to create a regional housing agency in the Bay Area, are examples of bills that came out of this process. And there are many more that now I'm going to kick it over to Cresselia to talk about.
Yes, but and just to add to that, Pedro, I think it was really important. A lot of the Casa ideas that became part of the three, or inform the three Ps in the coalition that built, and some of the pieces of legislation that were successful. One of the things that was so refreshing in Sacramento to see is when you actually brought a coalition together, and when we were having meetings with different elected officials, and we were able to bring builders and city planners and nonprofit developers and affordable housing just partners, that coalition normally is not seen in Sacramento. So I think that gave a lot of electeds pause to say, wait a minute, if all of these people are coming to the table and reaching consensus, that means these are pieces of legislation that are important and good. And so I think that type of collaboration has been really helpful, and explaining to people how all of these different solutions are integrated. So that was one of the reasons I think we are continuing to work as a three-piece coalition, just because of that success, and trying to really, as Assemblymember Rivas was saying, really collaborate. And this is really looking at it from a holistic approach. And one of the things originally, when some of the pieces of legislation were introduced, they were supposed to be Bay Area only. But because the ideas were well thought out and really well developed, many of the members that started to look at the bills are like, wait a minute, why are we going to only limit these good policy options to the Bay Area? We should extend them to be statewide policy. And you kind of see that some of that dialogue and some of those pieces of legislations becoming the seeds for what became, or now we're going to talk about a little bit of the housing packages in Sacramento. So I think next slide. All right, hi everyone. So as you guys know, my name is Cresselia Castillo-Crings. I'm a lobbyist in Sacramento, and I actually represent California YIMBY, Silicon Valley at Home, and actually do some work for NPH as well. So very excited to be here. A couple of things that is going on. Again, we have seen in Sacramento a shift in actually prioritizing housing. If you actually look at some of the discussions, it was not as mainstream as it is. And I think part of that, there's a crisis that is facing our state that is really impacting the ability for our state to grow, both from an economic perspective, but also just making sure that the public services and just the social commitment that we have to our state actually is accomplished. So over a couple of years, we really have been seeing how members have actually wanted to push for production. And I think the big shift over the last, again, decade, if you look at where people in conversations surrounded housing, it was really just looking at 100% affordable in terms of homelessness and some of those conversations, but that was kind of limited. Now we are really talking about how, for example, homeownership impacts equity in our communities, and how it can become a multi-generational wealth factor for people. We're looking at how moderate income housing is not being fulfilled, and how that is leading to a lot of people leaving the state. And we're starting to actually understand in a more comprehensive way the intersections also of policy between transportation, climate change, and housing. And so all of those things are coming to bear now. A couple of things, we started with big changes in policy back in 2017 under the Brown administration. There was a first set of package, and that's when first SB 35, which is a streamlining tool for the development. Now let's fast forward to where we are in 2020. So one thing that, as many of you might already know, SB 50, which was a very progressive piece of legislation, was really going to try to produce additional units and looking at creating better planning around transit hubs. When that bill unfortunately failed back in February, the Pro Tem made an announcement and basically said, we need to do better. We really need to do better. This is a problem that is facing California, and we are supposed to be the leaders that are bringing policy options forth. So what she basically committed to was working with her senators and coming out with a production package this year. This was going to be the year of production. So, and then COVID hit. And so that really changed the dynamics. At the beginning in January, when the governor proposed his first budget, everybody was looking at a very different economic situation. We were going to have money. We were going to be able to spend a little more money. The market was doing really well, which meant a lot of developers could actually lend or actually borrow money to produce bigger projects. That has shifted. So when the Pro Tem actually started engaging members, they started to factor in all these things. So what we have now in the Senate side, they've announced a Senate housing package, which is made up of 5 different pieces of legislation. And one of them is 1385 by Senator Caballero, which is basically taking and making it easier to reuse some of the commercial properties that are now going to be vacant. So especially after COVID, retail has been shifting. You have a lot of malls that are, half capacity. They're not the malls that people used to go to back in the 90s. And so you have pieces of land that have facilities on there that could be retooled. So 1385 says, you know what, why don't we make it easier to use? So that is one of the pieces that they are proposing. SB 1120, which is one of the bills actually being authored by the Pro Tem herself and Senator Wiener, is going to make it easier to do what we call lot splits and also do ministerial duplex. But I'm not going to get into that bill in detail because I know that's going to be covered later by one of my colleagues. We have another piece of legislation, SB 995, also by the Pro Tem, which is going to make it easier for what they call master EIR, which is just basically, at the end of the day, it's doing two things. It's making it easier to develop land and making it easier, or actually more timely, if a project is sued under CEQA, then it actually shortens the number of days by which a judge has to act. And again, we're trying to just ensure that projects are moving through the pipeline more quickly and things are being developed. And the last final two, SB 902, which I'm not going to get into again because Lewis is going to cover later, but SB 1085. There's been a lot of revisiting existing statutes. For example, density bonus is one that has been a tool on the books, but is not really being effectively used. And so there's been some research in trying to understand how can we reform and what are some of the changes that we need to do to ensure that the state laws actually are coming up to speed with what is happening in the market. How do we actually have government tools work better? How do these incentives, how can they be retooled? And so that piece of legislation is looking at ensuring that density bonus, which are incentives given to developers for producing affordable units, are used more widely and more effectively. So that's just in the Senate. The Assembly has not announced an official Assembly package. However, there's a lot of really good progressive policies that we are looking at and actually are supporting. AB 3155 by Assemblymember Rivas is one of them. Again, it's looking at smaller production. How do you incentivize denser growth in the cities, but in a way that is not completely changing the characteristics of communities? Again, a lot of rezoning changed in the 1970s. And if you go around Sacramento or San Francisco and you see you basically have single family homes next to another, what might seem like a single family home, but it's actually a duplex or sometimes a fourplex. You see this a lot in Sacramento, where you still preserve the Victorian look of a home, but inside there are actually 4 apartments. And so how do you actually provide that type of density to occur in a more organic way? So 3155 is a great bill that we're also sponsoring and working on. Another bill that is out there is AB 2323, which is it basically improves the CEQA exemptions already on the book and making development easier to occur. And just one other one that I just want to highlight is AB 2580, which is by Assemblywoman Eggman. And that bill actually, again, we have a lot of hotels and motels that are no longer being used, either because things have shifted, the economy is different. And so if a hotel and a motel is vacant and not being used, how do we make it easier for that type of property to be retooled and allow it to be used for families to live in, for maybe in other situations for previously homeless people? So how do we actually use existing infrastructure that we have? It's already been planned for, there's already different amenities around it, and how do we retool it to make it easier to house people? So that is one of the things I think overall the theme in the legislature has been, how do we improve, given that we don't have a lot of state funding right now, how do we actually make it easier for the market to develop affordable units for low-income families and also for moderate income families, right? At the end of the day, it's as long as it's affordable, that is something that we really are striving for. And one other thing, just to make sure that I don't forget, the Senate is also looking at having a potential rental protection package as part of the budget, as kind of Lewis had mentioned, and really looking at a partnership between the landlord, the renter, and the state. And so the state would step in and help a landlord basically, if a landlord says, yes, I have an apartment building, I would like to try to help my tenants because they are actually being impacted by COVID-19 and the ability for them to make money. So how do I work with the state to ensure that they get rental relief, they don't get evicted? And if the landlord is voluntarily and willing to do that, the state will then help pay the rent, and eventually later on, the actual tenant will pay the state back. And in the meantime, the actual landlord actually gets tax breaks and credits. So those are details that are still being fleshed out, but there is a worry in the legislature right now. How do you not only produce more housing, but do you also make sure that people stay in their homes, they're able to pay rent, and they're not evicted? So that's kind of the conversation that is in Sacramento right now. And I think we're going to questions.
Hi, Cresselia. So we do have two questions, but before we dive into them, there was a question about a synopsis document outlining some of the legislative bills that you covered, because I think that's a lot of information. So what we'll go ahead and do is when we send out a follow-up email after the webinar, we'll include that type of document so that people can follow along with the bills that you referenced as well, and any kind of supplemental information that they may need to have a better understanding. So the first question that we have is, we all know regulation has a huge impact on the cost and amount of housing in California. What is being done to further lessen regulation that is strangling the industry? Cresselia, you're muted.
I keep doing that. Apologize. So it would be helpful if we had a little more clarity as to if we have specific regulations. I know, again, if it's talking about CEQA, there is some streamlining. And I know that California YIMBY, along with a coalition, actually looked at a couple of regulations and is asking the governor to review the regulations and really understand which ones are having an impact on housing, because that is something that we are concerned about. However, it's important to understand if there's more clarity as to the type of regulation. And I don't know if Luis and Pedro have anything else to add.
Hearing none from Luis or Pedro, we're just gonna move on to the next question. So the next question for you, Cresselia, is, I have trouble making sense of housing as an investment for multi-generational wealth building. Housing being an investment vehicle seems to be in conflict with housing being affordable. Can you or others comment on this?
Yes, so let me kind of, when we talk about, there has been, if you look at history in terms of race equity, part of the thing is there actually used to be language in a lot of the deeds that would actually preclude anybody who was, who was basically anybody of color, African American, anybody who was not unfortunately white. And some of those covenants were actually then established in the federal government, because if you didn't have that kind of language in your deed, the federal government was not going to back your loan, which then, this started happening back at the turn of the century. In the 1930s, the federal government started to require this as part of them backing a loan. So that meant that a lot of banks would actually not issue a loan to communities of color. And that's what actually started the Fair Housing Act at the federal level, because people started to say, wait, and that, again, all of this happened at the turn of the century. By the 1960s, people started to just really understand the implications and how that was actually keeping a lot of communities of color from owning a home. And that started to change. And so if you remember, if your family bought a home in the 1950s, to fast forward to a couple, but maybe 20 years later, that home was worth something. That actually you actually built an equity that you can pass on to your children. Well, if you are precluded from actually owning or buying a home because of policies that have been established, then you can't pass on that equity to your family. You can't have that type of savings in your home. And so that's one of the things that I think when we talk about building wealth as part of communities of colors, that's what we're talking about. And so fast forward to today, when homes are in California on average $500,000, you can't actually own a home anymore. And that becomes more and more like difficult to do. And so it makes it harder for people to actually acquire wealth by having a home, like an investment. Because back, people used to think, hey, as long as you get into the market and you're actually able to buy a home, you're able to create an investment. But if you never have the ability to actually purchase a home in the first place, that's something that's completely not accessible to you. And so I think that's one of the things that where we look at the ability and access to actually owning a home is really important to building wealth. And so that's what I think we kind of, for me at least, I look at as well. I don't know if Luis or Pedro would like to add anything to that.
I think that's totally right, and I think the big distinction there is that like families can, you know, essentially save the money that they're spending on rent and just keep it in an asset for themselves and for the rest of their family and for their kids, or they can give that money to their landlord. And so there's a real long-term benefit to just homeownership generally to passing down wealth. And research strongly indicates that the reason for the racial wealth gap in the United States is that white families have had access to homeownership subsidies and to homeownership itself at the cost consequence of non-white people not getting them. And that's even more so than the income gap. It's that subsidy and that homeownership that has driven the wealth gap in this country.
And to add to that, I mean, if you look at rent prices, when you buy a home, you basically, and have a mortgage, that's all you're going to pay for 30 years. But if you are a renter, then you're subject to those rents increasing. And you can see that here in Sacramento, is because I live in Sacramento and I have a better understanding of the market here. 16 years ago, you could get a one-bedroom apartment in Sacramento for $600. That is no longer the case. Now, a one-bedroom apartment in the same area is anywhere from 1,500 to actually 2,500. That's a very, very large increase. And this is just within 16 years. And so if you had bought a home at the same time and your mortgage was, let's say, 700 or 800, it doesn't matter if 16 years have gone by, that's still your mortgage. As opposed to now, when you're actually looking at the rental and how much it has increased, if you are a renter, you are now subject to all of the fluctuations in the market. And in California, you haven't necessarily seen the decrease in rents as you have in other states, even during the recession and even now. So that's what we talk about. When you actually look at how rents impact a community, it's not impacting high earners. It's really impacting a lot of working class, moderate income families. And that's what we mean by some of these policies and the implications they have, not just for 1 year or two, but really multi-generational.
Great, thank you, Cresselia. So we're going to go ahead and answer one or two more questions before we shift to the next segment of our webinar together. So we have a question. My rental in Palo Alto is 3 units on one lot, was demolished to build one or rental single family home. Are there any laws in the works to prevent demolitions like this? I understand that SB 330 prevents it for rent control units, but we don't have rent control there.
I think that is a big issue that we have encountered, demolitions. And so I know that a lot of the pieces of legislation that we are working on is trying to be very protective of that. So we're trying to balance, how do you actually streamline and allow for production to happen, but ensure that that kind of displacement and that kind of what ends up happening, which is demolition, doesn't occur. So a lot of protections are being built in. For example, some of the pieces of legislation that I talked about, they already have provisions in there that you, for example, cannot demolish. You can maybe demolish a wall, but not the entire structure. The other thing is you cannot demolish if people have been living there for the previous 3 years. Especially if it's rent control, you definitely cannot demolish for, sometimes 10 or 15 years, depending on how that is structured. But that is a big consideration, and that is a policy discussion that I know is definitely being contemplated, and there's protections that are being built in, at least for the legislation that we're working on right now.
Great, thank you, Cresselia. So we're going to go ahead and pause the Q&A for this right now and then circle back towards the end of the webinar if we have more time. But we need to keep moving on to the next section. So Cresselia, thank you so much for joining us again. And then now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Pedro, Policy Director with Nonprofit Housing Association. Pedro?
Hi, thanks again for that, Mario, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here. So amongst the housing package of bills, or just the housing bills that are being floated on for this session, there are two bills that my organization is helping to lead the work on that we believe are going to be very helpful in building more subsidized, affordable housing throughout the state of California. One bill that we're particularly excited by is SB 899, which is being authored by Senator Wiener. And what SB 899 will do is it would allow places of worship, including churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, nonprofit colleges, and nonprofit hospitals to partner with affordable housing developers to build 100% affordable housing on land that they own in a way that cuts through a lot of the process. And so by that, I mean, if there's existing zoning that restricts it to just single family housing, this bill would actually allow you to build 100% affordable housing that's multifamily, regardless of the local zoning on that land. It would also make the construction process simpler by ensuring that these projects conform to the local standards. So whatever local design standards for that housing that exist, the project would still need to conform with. But other than that, the construction of these affordable apartments would be allowed. And so the point of pushing this bill is that in many places throughout California, and alluding to some of the redlining history that Cresselia mentioned, a lot of communities of opportunity have systemically made affordable housing illegal to build in most of those communities. And places of worship tend to be one of the few local institutions that actively partner with affordable housing developers to build subsidized housing in those communities. And so this bill is estimated to open up as much as 38,000 acres of land all across the state, more than half of which are in neighborhoods that the Department of Housing and Community Development classifies as high opportunity through various measures, through educational outcomes, income. And so it's a way to integrate communities, and it's a way to build more subsidized affordable housing for our seniors, veterans, working families, and people with disabilities. So that's one bill that we are promoting. The other bill that we're working on this year is AB 2058 by Assemblymember Gabriel. And we're working on that one alongside the Western Center for Law and Poverty, California Housing Partnership Corporation, as well as the California Coalition for Rural Housing. And what that bill does is many people live in apartments that are currently unsubsidized. Most people do. And they might be paying rents that are below market, but they also live in a jurisdiction where there is no rent control. And so what this bill will do is it will create a tax credit for the owners of those apartments to actually sell to a nonprofit organization that will will stabilize those rents and keep them affordable for the long term. And this is critical because in the Bay Area alone, there are about 300,000 such units where maybe they're older, maybe they are in neighborhoods where there's less development, but for whatever reason, they're charging below market rents, but they don't have any restrictions to keep those rents stabilized. And so this creates an incentive for those owners rather than selling it to a developer who does not have a mission to keep those homes affordable, to sell it to organizations that will maintain the affordability of those units in the long term. And so both of these bills are moving right now. And we'd love to have your letters of support. Our organization has made it really easy, and I can share a link with Mario after this to share with you, where you can just click and submit a letter of support. They do matter. But yeah, so those are the main bills that we're directly working on this year, and I would love to take your questions.
Great, thank you, Pedro, for that update. There is a question. Is SB 899 limited to 50 DUs per acre or development units per acre and 55 feet height limits, aka low density development? How did you get to the total number of units it will create?
That's a great question. So what the bill does is, depending on where the lot is that will be developed as affordable housing, it establishes a new minimum density. And so if the lot is in a single family neighborhood, it establishes a new minimum density going up from generally 1 unit per acre to 35 units an acre. And that is a minimum density. That doesn't mean it's the limit to how many units you can put on that lot. That number depends on the height of the building. It also depends on the lot size. So say you have a 2-acre lot, if you were to do a 35 units an acre, you could do 70 units on a 2-acre lot. And so the density that was chosen for the single family lots was because that's generally considered density that makes affordable housing developments economically feasible to do. And so, SB 899 doesn't preclude affordable housing developers from using other tools to increase the number of units even more, like the density bonus. And so that's how we chose it for that. And for the 50 units an acre and 55 feet height, that density and height are for parcels that are commercially zoned, but again, don't allow for residential development. And most affordable housing developments in California are between 4 to 5 stories. So that's a way to get at the height of most affordable housing in the state. And also that density is actually pretty high. If you think about it, there are very few places that currently have such high densities in the state as a whole. So not a problem for San Francisco, for a lot of San Francisco, not a problem for a good chunk of Oakland and for parts of San Jose, but definitely something that would be considered pretty high density in a lot of the Bay Area, the more suburban jurisdictions, and throughout the state. And so, and again, just like with the 35 units an acre density, it's something that depends on the lot size. So if you have a 2-acre lot, you could even do 100 units there. You could pair it with other incentives to build more units, like the density bonus. So we thought that those were reasonable baselines relative to what currently exists in the state, in a way that would work to build a lot of affordable housing.
Great, thank you, Pedro, for that. So we're going to pause there with Pedro for now, and then we're going to go ahead and hear from Luis with California YIMBY on some of the legislative bills that their organization has put forward and how folks can get involved if they want to. Luis?
Hey, yeah. So thanks again for the opportunity. Definitely excited to talk to you about SB 902 and SB 1120 today. These bills are bills that California YIMBY has been advocating for in some form for a couple of years now. And, pretty excited to see that there seems to be some progress here. Let me start with SB 902. And I just want to make sure make sure I'm clear. We are the sponsor of SB 902, but we're just big supporters of SB 1120. So we're not sponsoring that one, but the distinction doesn't matter to most people, but just want to make sure I was clear. Sorry about that. So SB 902 is a big bill from Senator Wiener. Folks may have heard about it, last month. It's changed a bit in the last week, so quite a bit. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But in general, this is sort of a follow-up to some of the work that he's been doing over the last few years on zoning reform, trying to make it easier for people to build housing in especially communities where there's a lot of opportunity, there's been a lot of historic exclusion. And so this, yeah, is just generally consistent with what he's been working on for a while. SB 902 would let a city rezone itself for buildings that are 10 units or fewer, similar to the type of buildings that you heard Assemblymember Rivas talk about earlier, these more naturally affordable, smaller duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. I'm actually here in a very reasonably priced quadplex in my neighborhood in Sacramento. It's the type of housing that we really need a lot more of in California for sure. The reason that's important to let local governments do this is that local governments are currently between sort of a rock and a hard place when it comes to housing in many regions around the state. On one hand, they have to comply with their regional housing needs assessments, which is a number that they get from basically the state of California that says, here's the number of homes you need to plan for over the next 8 years. So they have to plan for those. But to adopt those plans where they're planning for those housing units, they also have to get by their voters, and they have to get by NIMBY lawsuits against those plans. And so the goal of SB 902 is to prevent frivolous lawsuits from being filed against those plans, making it significantly easier for local governments to adopt them. That means it'll be cheaper for them to adopt them. It'll mean it'll be faster for them to adopt those upzoning plans. And that means it'll be more likely that we'd see an increase in housing production in the future as a result of the housing element process. So it's a good bill. It gets a lot of the red tape out of the way for adopting a plan to upzone at the local level. It's a discretionary action by the local government. The state doesn't require them to use SB 902, but I think local governments will see it as really beneficial because it's going to make the job that they're already legally required to do a lot easier. SB 1120, on the other hand, is more of the sort of preemptive type of legislation that you're probably familiar with from Senator Wiener. It says, this bill is from the pro tem Senator Tony Atkins, and it says that a local government cannot ban duplexes, essentially, within certain circumstances anywhere in California. So it has some protections there for tenants, trying to address kind of the concern that we heard earlier. So you wouldn't be allowed to use SB 1120 on rental housing. It's currently occupied by tenants. And basically the idea here is that we're going to be requiring local governments to really step up to the plate and allow duplexes everywhere in the state, and really, trying to get at some of these places that have been using hyper low density zoning in an exclusionary way. This bill is similar to kind of the stuff that you've seen from the Assembly on accessory dwelling units. But the benefit here is that this is going to allow bigger homes and for sale homes, addressing some of the home ownership problems there. And it'll allow, hopefully it'll allow ADUs in addition to the new unit that it'll be creating as well. So there's some nuance there, but that I can get into sort of in Q&A, but that's an exciting one. So on the one, you have 902 that makes it easier for local governments to plan for housing. And then on the other, you have SB 1120, which requires local governments to approve housing if it's not even if it's not consistent with their local zoning, if it meets certain specified criteria and is basically a duplex. So yeah, I think I can pause there. Oh, advocacy. If you are interested in supporting either of these bills, I definitely have resources for you. I don't have a link for you to use on 1120 yet, but I do have one for you to use on SB 902. that I can be sure to share with you all after the call. Mario, maybe I'll pass it along too, and I don't know, we can bundle that with Pedro's links. But yeah, otherwise, my email is louis@caimb.org, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me if you have questions about any of this stuff, or you want, advice about how to support any of it. Again, that's louis@caimb.org.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and pause to receive any questions that we may have, particularly for you on these two bills. But in the meantime, there was another question that we didn't get to in the previous segment, which was, what can we do to get more housing for people with disabilities who need rents, 30% of SSI payments? And then what can we do to provide universal access in housing? And I think that's a question that was asked during Pedro's. So I don't know if Pedro, you want to be able to answer that question, or you, Cresselia, be able to chime in.
Sure. Happy to. So I think that question is absolutely critical and kind of speaks to a lot of the bills that we are collectively promoting. The housing crisis in California has gotten to a point where it's become so extreme that a lot of subsidies that are meant to be targeted to low-income people are starting to be targeted towards moderate-income households. And we don't think that that's a good use of public money. We think that a lot of moderate-income households could get more housing if we just loosen some of the zoning restrictions around duplexes and fourplexes, and making it easier to just build homes for middle-class people, so that we can use our limited funding to target exactly people on SSI and people who otherwise would not be able to live in California. And so in general, like, our focus is, let's use the subsidies for those who need it the most. And we do actively advocate for the use of our limited resources to those ends. So that's just one general thing that NPH does, and that I believe, is in general agreement with the affordable housing advocacy community. And then as far as universal accessible housing, I think that we have a long way to go. I do think that there's work that needs to be done around some of the regulatory requirements for the funding to create more universal housing types. So it's not just restricted to a couple of units, but just building more universal types of units, so that they're just accessible by default and it's not an extra thing. And that there's significant work to be done with that, aligning funding and conversations that need to be had also with affordable housing developers. And that is something that I know some of our partners, and major shout out to the Kelsey for leading some of these conversations. But that's an ongoing issue that we collectively need to do better and to provide more accessible housing.
Great, thank you for that, Pedro. Are there any other questions directed towards Luis from California YIMBY on SB 902 or SB 1120 from the audience? Okay, hearing none. I'm just going to go ahead and open it up to the panelists and see if there's any other additional questions that may come up from the audience through the Q&A feature at the bottom of this page. And Cresselia and Pedro, if you have anything else to add that you may have missed the first time around, now's the time to be able to chime in.
I would just generally say thank you for the opportunity to be here, Mario, and also for the folks who have participated on this webinar. You are clearly interested and engaged to have sat through this, wonky housing policy conversation, and we'd love to turn your energy into advocacy. And so NPH, California YIMBY, the general work that's being done by the Three Ps Coalition, we could all use your support. And I know that this stuff it can get really arcane, really wonky. There's a lot of acronyms thrown around. We can have an entire acronym soup conversation. And so if we're doing that, please call us out on it and also help us help you be engaged, because your involvement really does matter. And elected officials like Assemblymember Robert Rivas early on really does value your input and your engagement with all of this, and so do other elected officials. So anything that we can do to help you engage in these questions directly, please let us know how we can do better. And so again, major thanks to Mario and the team of SV at Home for having me here. But other than that, nothing to add.
Great, thank you for that, Pedro. Cresselia, we do have a question that just came in. To what extent do we think the bills in the Senate housing package are quote unquote fully baked versus subject to further potential amendments?
Oh no, there's definitely going to be opportunity for us to further kind of continue to refine the policy. And I think that goes back to Pedro's point, kind of, this is an opportunity for people to kind of weigh in, give your opinions. I think the Pro Tem is putting it out. We're basically going to have between now and August to really ensure that we get the policy right. So any feedback, any comments, I think use organizations like SV at Home and California YIMBY and NPH. Let us know what the concerns are so that we can actually take those comments to the legislature, let them know what we're hearing, how it would actually work. And so there's going to be an opportunity for sure.
Great, thank you for that. Any final words from you, Luis or Cresselia, before we end the webinar?
Just really appreciative of, like Pedro was saying, the opportunity to speak to you all today, and really appreciate, one of the things that is really beneficial, I think, for California YIMBY is our partners with organizations around the state, like SV at Home, who take a real focus on their community and can bring that focus to their elected representatives. And so, your continued participation and advocacy around how the housing debate has been, really beneficial, especially with folks who represent Silicon Valley, and would encourage anyone on the call to, continue organizing with you all. And if they're not organizing with you, to start organizing with you. And just want to say how much I appreciate you guys keeping up the good fight in Silicon Valley, probably one of the most in need places in California for affordable housing. So thank you.
Thanks, Luis.
Thank you so much, Mario. And again, I completely agree. The fact that we have participants willing to kind of stay with us for over an hour and really care about housing, I think it means a lot. And if we can kind of turn that into activism and help use your voices and enthusiasm to tell the legislature that some of these reforms are needed, would be really, really impactful. So thank you so much for the time.
Of course, thank you all for taking time to participate and present with us today. We really appreciate it on behalf of everyone here at SV at Home. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and close out. There's a couple of things that I do want to mention before we hop off. One of them is we will be following up via email with everyone that registered and attended today's webinar, and provide a recording or a link to the webinar recording so that you can view it again if you need to find additional information that you might have missed the first time around. I think one of the questions was around a one-pager or additional information, a synopsis document that can be shared with folks, given the number of legislative bills and the differences between them. It's kind of difficult to be able to track all of that in an hour and a half. So what we're going to go ahead and do is think about whether a one-pager makes sense, or whether creating a standing page for legislative advocacy on our SV at Home website would make sense for you to be able to get that information, but also share it with others in an easy to digest format. And so with that, I just want to thank everybody again for taking time to join us this Friday morning, afternoon. We do have a couple of additional webinars that are going to be happening later this afternoon, and those relate to the Santa Clara County eviction moratorium that has been extended. As earlier this week, the Board of Supervisors took that action, actually. So we're going to be partnering with the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley to host that. Feel free to visit us online at siliconvalleyathome.org. And scroll over to the events page, where you'll be able to find the information to register and participate should you be interested in learning more about the county's moratorium, eviction moratorium here locally. But other than that, thank you so much and have a great day. Bye.